U.S. government and corporate financier funded policymakers at CSIS, that is the Center for Strategic and International Studies. They have recently published a report detailing the immense military-industrial output of the Russian Federation. And the report is actually a follow-up of a report they published last year in which claims that Russia was suffering from Western sanctions and that military-industrial output would suffer as well. So this is a revision of those conclusions, and I'm going to talk about both reports. This one is Back in Stock: The State of Russia's Defense Industry After 2 Years of the War, and it is a follow-up of this report from last year, Out of Stock: Assessing the Impact of Sanctions on Russia's Defense Industry. And I'm going to talk about why CSIS at least claims to have believed that Russia would run into production problems last year. I believe it was because of political purposes, not because that was their objective conclusion. And I will go over the difference between the two papers here in just a moment. But why would politics be playing into what this think tank full of analysts and researchers, why would that play into their conclusions? A lot of people ask me, who really runs the United States, if not the politicians in Washington? Well, it is the special interests that are funding these think tanks. And of course, if you go to their website, CSIS's website, they receive money from the US government and the governments that the US influences significant control over. They also receive huge amounts of money from corporations and financial institutes. There's a full list here. It includes Amazon, Bank of America, Chevron, Exxon, GSK, so Lockheed Martin, a combination of big arms, big oil, big pharma, big agriculture is almost certainly somewhere in there. The largest, most powerful corporate financier interests in the collective West drive US foreign and domestic policy. And they do it by funding these think tanks who produce these policy papers. This helps form consensus. The papers are transformed by lawyers into bills that go to Washington with lobbyists who have it signed off by our supposed representatives. And then the corporate media, who is a partner with these corporations and the think tanks that fund these corporations, they sell these policies to the American people to convince us all that it is all in our best interest to go along with these policies. That is how it really works. Contrary to the diagram you saw in your high school social studies book, let's get to this 2024 paper, Back in Stock: The State of Russia's Defense Industry After 2 Years of the War. It was published April 22nd, 2024, so relatively recently. It says, as Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine drags into its third year, Russia's defense industry has found ways to get what it needs to ramp up arms production. The Kremlin still relies on foreign components to fuel its war effort, but has been able to maneuver around the Western sanctions regime by turning to countries willing to supply its defense sector, or by using complex cutouts to acquire Western components indirectly. With these parts and components secured, Russia has been able to leverage its sizable weapons stockpile built up over the Cold War period. These stockpiles of aging and often outdated equipment have enabled the Russian defense industry to overhaul and modernize older platforms quickly and at lower cost. Russia has also claimed to have increased production of some newer weapon systems entirely from scratch. In both cases, whether refurbishing older or producing brand new systems, the Kremlin has continued to rely on foreign components imported via a complicated network of intermediaries. This has proved critical to sustaining the Russian military in Ukraine. This report is a follow-up to the April 2023 report, Out of Stock: Assessing the Impact of sanctions on Russia's defense industry. Last year's report concluded that during the first year of the war, sanctions created shortages of higher-end foreign components, while Moscow's efforts at state-backed import substitution were largely limited. The sanctions affected Russia's ability to manufacture, sustain, and deliver advanced weapons and technologies to the battlefield in Ukraine. The report said the war would stress Russia's military-industrial base, already stretched thin by sanctions and high battlefield losses during the first 12 months of the invasion, which was all propaganda, and reports like this helped support that propaganda. The corporate media, the collective Western media, claiming that Russia was going to run out of weapons and that the sanctions were biting, that military-industrial capacity was shrinking and crumbling. We remember all of those headlines about Russia running out of tanks, running out of aircraft, running out of missiles. Any month now, Russian missiles are going to be exhausted. And then in reality, that was never the case. This previous report and now this follow-up report are trying to act as if over the last year somehow Russia has managed to turn things around. It simply isn't so. You cannot create this scale of military-industrial production over the course of a single year. This was already in place before the special military operation was launched, and it was always the case that Russia was outproducing the collective West. It insulated itself from sanctions before the conflict even began, and that is why they are capable of not just sustaining their war effort in Ukraine, they are outproducing the collective West. Before I go any further into this 2024 paper, let's talk about the conclusions and recommendations from the 2023 paper to see just how far off that they were, and then we can assess where they are now. So one, it said sanctions work by creating shortages of certain higher-end components and forcing the Russian Ministry of Defense to substitute them with lower quality alternatives. Does anyone still believe that Russian weapons are inferior, of low quality, are in some way ineffective, looking at what is now manifesting itself on the battlefield? I think not. Russia still possesses a remarkable degree of adaptability to Western sanctions. In many ways, the Western sanctions only made Russia stronger. And this has been the case since 2014. It's not something recent. They realized that the West was going to continue encircling and containing them. They began looking inward to replace their dependency externally. And that is exactly what they did. And come 2022, they were more or less prepared. Sanctions have made Moscow opt for a slower-paced attritional campaign. Now that is false. Russia opted for a slower-paced attritional campaign because it wants to preserve its manpower and equipment while having the capability to destroy Ukrainian military capabilities. Ultimately, Russia anticipates a direct NATO intervention in Ukraine. Whether it comes or not, that's another story, but they are preparing for it. They do not want to throw their forces into prepared and manned Ukrainian defenses like Ukraine did in 2023 against Russian defenses and lose huge amounts of manpower and equipment. Even if they do manage a breakthrough, there's no point to do that when they could preserve their manpower and equipment and whittle away at Ukrainian capabilities, cause a collapse, and advance that way, which is exactly what they're doing. And I think their approach is, for all to see, vindicated. The recommendation, so those were the conclusions. The recommendations the 2023 paper made were this. First, continue supplying Ukraine with higher-end military equipment at a pace that exceeds Russia's production rate, which will make it harder for Russia to maintain an attritional war. That was never possible. The West at no point was outproducing Russia in any way. It was always providing fewer systems to Ukraine in terms of quantity, and as it turns out, also in terms of quality. It says, identify and target illicit networks and particularly individuals involved in current sanctions evasion efforts. The problem is, if Russia worked on making itself more self-sufficient and is working with other nations who are also being targeted and sanctioned by the US, who don't care about violating Western sanctions against another nation, then there really is no amount of monitoring or enforcement that is going to work. And basically all of their other recommendations come down to trying to monitor and enforce sanctions, which from 2023 to 2024 have not made any visible difference. So that was the paper last year, claiming that Russian military industrial capacity was hit hard by sanctions and that the US needed to keep pressure on Russia to hit it even harder. What are they saying this year in their 2024 paper? In late December 2023, the Russian Ministry of Defense announced that throughout the past year, the military received more than 1,500 tanks, 2,200 armored combat vehicles, 1,400 missiles and artillery weapons, and 22,000 UAVs or drones. While impressive, the authors believe these numbers to be inflated. Additionally, it is difficult to estimate what share of these weapons were produced locally from scratch, what share was refurbished, and what share was imported from third countries willing to do business with Russia, which is mainly the entire world outside of the West. Still, these Ministry of Defense figures paint a picture of a reinvigorated domestic defense industrial sector capable of replenishing its military with new and modernized weapons, and they left out the part where Russia is doing this at a rate greater than the collective West can. Also, these numbers that they're giving, these are enormous numbers. These are numbers the entire West combined are not capable of achieving. We know a lot of these tanks are being refurbished and modernized. That is how they can achieve 1,500 tanks. But the fact of the matter is the West refurbishes and modernizes a lot of their tanks. I just did a whole video about how the brand new Challenger 3 main battle tank will be built entirely from Challenger 2 tanks that they're just refurbishing and modernizing and upgrading. And a lot of the new M1 Abrams tanks that you see are also being built from older tanks that are just being refurbished and modernized. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. As I've explained many times before, you take a hull, you take a turret, and you're replacing the engine, the gun, the fire control, and the optics. It is, for all intents and purposes, a new tank. It will operate on the battlefield like a new tank. The CSIS paper also says a little bit about how Russia is expanding military-industrial production. It says the government claims to have increased the number of defense workers, with some state-run plants and factories transitioning to 24-hour shift schedule, simplified the procedure for concluding contracts with the Russian Ministry of Defense for development and production of military products, and shorten the required timeline for selecting components and testing new weapons, among other things. The Ministry of Defense also claims to have implemented a system of interdepartmental coordination to monitor and organize the work of defense industrial enterprises and respond to issues arising during production and repair of military equipment. It is likely that Russia will proceed with these efforts in 2024. Now, whether the numbers that Russia is claiming to produce are inflated or not, we can see on the battlefield the fact that Russia is outproducing the West. That is manifesting itself on the battlefield. These policies that the Russian government is implementing across its military-industrial base are possible because its military-industrial base is comprised of a vast network of state-owned enterprises. Their goal is to do what the state tells them to do, and the state is asking them to produce vast quantities of cheap but effective military equipment, and that is what they are doing. Conversely, the West's military-industrial base is comprised of private enterprise. They prioritize profit. That's why when the government asks them to produce large quantities of cheap equipment to invest large sums of money to expand production, they won't do it because it's cutting into their profits. There's a systemic difference between Russia and the collective West that is allowing Russia to outcompete and outproduce the collective West. Then they get into specific areas. So they already talked a little bit about tanks. They get into tanks, more deeply. It says, throughout 2023, the Russian military continued to rely on its tank force, reportedly receiving more than 1,500 tanks, approximately 125 per month, and losing somewhere between 600 and 874, approximately 50 to 73 per month, based on different estimates. You check the sources they're citing are all of these open source intelligence projects that I've already talked about many times before. These were the same open source intelligence projects telling the world that Russia's military was already decimated and that the Ukrainian offensive in 2023 would roll over this broken, poorly led, poorly equipped force, when it was the exact opposite. So I don't know how much faith you want to put in these open source intelligence numbers. But even if you believe these numbers, they're telling you there's 125 tanks being built every month, and then there's 50 to 73 tanks being destroyed. Over time, Russia is going to have more and more tanks. It's basic math. While these open source data suggest Russian tank production has increased, allowing the Russian army to maintain a large tank force despite continued losses of these vehicles, the analytical community also believes the 1,500 tanks delivered last year likely include a number of refurbished tanks from the battlefield as opposed to new build hulls and turrets. Well, it's not what you believe. That is the truth. The Russian government admits that it refurbishes large numbers of tanks, refurbishes and modernizes them and puts them on the battlefield. For instance, one NATO official recently claimed that about 86% of the main battle tanks Russia produced in 2023 were refurbished. While Moscow has been estimated to maintain 5,000 tanks in storage, the official noted that probably a large percentage of those can't be refurbished and are only good for cannibalizing parts. But that is what you do with these old stored tanks. You take whatever is good to use and you use that to produce a refurbished, modernized tank. Another open source analysis examining satellite imagery has argued that Russia has removed between 25 to 40% of its tank strategic reserves from open air storage facilities since 2022. And again, this is open source intelligence. It's basically repackaged war propaganda. It's very difficult to know what to make of it. And also, even if you take this claim at face value, so they've taken 25 to 40% out of open air storage. Has that quantity already been refurbished, modernized, and put on the battlefield? Or is it just being moved to a place where it's being staged and fed into the production line? And has that supply already been exhausted? They never get into any of that. And I don't think they have any way of really knowing that. 125 tanks per month, 1,500 tanks per year. That is what Russia is putting out on the battlefield. That is what CSIS is reporting at any rate. Let's put that number into perspective. Let's compare that with US tank production. We have two articles here. This is from Politico, and in this article they mention monthly production, 12 tanks. And this article from Defense Express, which is a UA website, this is a pro-Ukrainian media. US made 75 M1 Abrams per month in the 1980s. Now 12 is the limit. So even back in the 80s, Russia would be outproducing the United States. It says between 1979 and 1993, the US defense industry produced 8,800 M1 Abrams main battle tanks in total. The average was 840 units annually, so fewer than what Russia is producing right now. The capacity could be doubled or even tripled if necessary. However, the ongoing defense contracts indicate a reduced production rate nowadays of only 12 tanks per month, or up to 135 per year. 135 per year, that is around the amount of tanks that Russia produces in a single month. And then it starts talking about how many of the tanks that the United States is rolling off the production line are actually also refurbished and modernized. It says the American industry now primarily focuses on modernizing old tanks taken from storage. Quite often the stored vehicles are tanks in the name only, as even the turrets were stripped, leaving empty hulls. Still, even these shells become source material for making new units. So that goes back to what I was saying about these analysts saying the tanks Russia is storing are in bad condition and only certain parts can be used, the same can be said about tanks the US is storing and using as source material for refurbished, modernized tanks. And again, there is nothing wrong with doing this. There's nothing wrong with Russia doing this. There's nothing wrong with the US or the UK doing this. But if you're going to refurbish and modernize old tanks, you need to be able to do it on a large scale and cheaply. Russia is doing that. The US and UK are incapable of doing that because it is being done by for-profit industry. It says visual evidence coming from the battlefield confirms this reporting, showing Russia deploying its 60-year-old T-62 tanks and 70-year-old T-55 tanks against the Ukrainian forces. As the overall quantity of old Soviet tanks in Russia's storage likely remains in the several thousands, the Russian MOD can field such vehicles over the course of many months in 2024, I would say probably for many years, assuming they can be refurbished and are not awaiting dismantlement. Public analysis of the Ukrainian battlefield shows that some of these Russian tanks received upgrades such as new radios, modern optics, and additional layers of reactive armor, with the most common upgrade to both newer and older tanks being the anti-drone metal cages and slat armor. Now, a lot of these much older tanks, T-62s, T-55s, these are not being placed on the battlefield to serve in the main battle tank role. They're being used as assault guns. It's basically a heavily armored mobile gun that the infantry can call on to target fortified enemy positions. A main battle tank is meant to do armored assaults, advance quickly over the battlefield, assault an enemy position, not sit back and fire it from a distance, direct fire artillery basically. They're also meant, main battle tanks are also meant for tank-on-tank combat. A T-62 or T-55 would not be used for that role by Russia. So they're conflating these older tanks being used as assault guns with the main battle tanks Russia is refurbishing, modernizing, and rolling onto the battlefield in large quantities. Some might say, Brian, Western main battle tanks are better than Russian tanks. Doesn't matter that Russia makes many times more tanks than the US. One US tank is worth 10 Russian tanks. But we know that simply isn't true. That is a long-standing myth, but it is a myth that has been busted throughout the duration of the special military operation in Ukraine. We have articles like this from even the most stalwart pro-Ukrainian commentators. This is Hamish the Breton Gordon. He had been in the British Army as an officer for many years. The title of his article is Russia has found the critical vulnerability in NATO's American tanks. 5 of the 31 M1 Abrams tanks delivered last year have already been destroyed by Russian forces at the time of recording this. The number is now up to, I believe, 7 out of 31. This is what his article says. The arrival of the US M1A1 Abrams tank in Ukraine was hailed as a turning point in the war by the Western media. Serious, objective analysts predicted that it would make absolutely no difference, that they would be ineffective on the battlefield, and that is exactly what has happened. Coming in at roughly $10 million a unit, the NATO stalwart was supposed to provide the armored fist that would punch through the Russian lines, but tactics evolve quickly in warfare, and Russia's use of surveillance and hunter-killer drones has led to heavy casualties for Ukraine's tank fleets. It's actually a much larger number of factors that have contributed to the destruction of Ukraine's tank fleets. Remember, during the 2023 offensive, Ukraine was using Leopard 2 tanks, a number of Challenger 2 tanks, and they were moving them across the battlefield, and they were being wiped out by a combination of mines, anti-tank guided missiles fired by infantry, but also by attack helicopters, of course, precision-guided artillery, and even other tanks. And of course, drones. This is alarming for NATO. If Russia has found critical vulnerabilities in our armor, our borders are beginning to look very vulnerable. Washington pledged 31 Abrams tanks to Ukraine in January last year. The first batch arrived in September. They finally appeared to make their combat debut in February this year, with the first video footage released on the 25th of February. On the 26th, the next day, the Russians scored their first Abrams kill 2 months after entering service. The Abrams tank is now being withdrawn from the front line. 5 of the 31 tanks delivered last year have already been destroyed. And he concludes the article by saying it's because of the tactics the Ukrainians are using. They're just sitting there with these tanks firing at Russian positions, and they're vulnerable out in the open. And what they should do instead is move at high speed toward Russian positions. But like I just said, they tried that in 2023 and it didn't work. An anti-tank guided missile travels at such speeds that a tank, whether it's parked or moving, as far as the missile is concerned, it's irrelevant. It's not moving. It is an easy target. Modern main battle tanks, whether they're produced by the West or by Russia, are similar in capability. They have the ability to see, target, and hit an enemy on the first shot at several kilometers off. Both Western and Russian main battle tanks can do this. The determining factor of whose tank force will be superior, because the reality is tanks on both sides are inevitably going to be destroyed, is who can replace them faster and more effectively. And it's very clear that it's Russia who can do that, not the collective West. Let's move on to artillery systems. Artillery has been such a crucial weapon system in this conflict. It says Russian military artillery has been used to devastating effect, with Russian systems firing thousands of shells daily across the entire front. Western military analysis points to the improving situation with artillery systems production and refurbishment, as well as delivery and use at the front. They're talking about Russian artillery. In 2022, the Russian industry quadrupled 152 millimeter artillery round production, manufacturing 1 million rounds, that is by 2022. This was achieved by reallocating production capacity from other shell calibers, so they say. To increase the quantity of ammunition produced, Rostec took control of 15 enterprises at the start of 2023. Today, the Russian military fields an estimated 4,700 barrel artillery systems, including the 2 S-19 howitzer and other systems that fire 122 millimeter and 152 millimeter rounds. The Russian military may also have as many as 1,100 multiple launch rocket systems. And a lot of these fire unguided rockets in large salvos for area effect. They also have multiple launch rocket systems that fire precision guided rockets, very similar to the HIMARS, but with a longer range. Rostec also indicated in December 2023 that it is testing the new Koalitsiya SV self-propelled artillery. Its mass production has already started, and there will likely be growing numbers of these systems deployed in Ukraine. The Koalitsiya SV is a cutting-edge self-propelled howitzer. It includes such innovations as a greater amount of automation for loading. It also uses microwave system to ignite the gunpowder. And the reason that they're doing this is because usually an artillery piece has a primer. It looks like a bullet shell without the bullet. It ignites, and in turn it ignites the gunpowder charge inside the barrel behind the artillery round. And it burns from the back where the primer ignited all the way to the front. And that is what is propelling the artillery shell out of the gun toward its target. When you use a microwave system to ignite the gunpowder, it's going to ignite it evenly, simultaneously, producing greater force, firing the artillery round faster and further. So Russia is not just producing huge numbers of artillery pieces, they're also producing advanced types of artillery pieces. They talked about Russian artillery shell production in 2022. More recently, there was this article from CNN. Russia producing 3 times more artillery shells than US and Europe for Ukraine. This is March 11th, 2024. It says Russia is producing about 250,000 artillery munitions per month, or about 3 million a year, according to NATO intelligence estimates of Russian defense production shared with CNN, as well as sources familiar with Western efforts to arm Ukraine. Collectively, the US and Europe have the capacity to generate only about 1.2 million munitions annually to send to Kiev, a senior European intelligence official told CNN. Now, the collective West is working their way toward 3 million. They might reach it, and I'm talking about the US and Europe combined. They might reach it by 2026, 2027, but by that time, Russia will only have further expanded its own artillery shell production. What about Ukrainian guns? We heard about the thousands of artillery pieces Russia has. What about Ukraine? It happens that CSIS also put out a report about Ukrainian artillery. This was published January 2023, expanding equipment options for Ukraine, the case of artillery. Ukraine started the war with approximately 1,150 Soviet-era howitzers, 750 152 millimeter howitzers, and 350 122 millimeter howitzers. Added to that, 424 plus howitzers received from allies. Ukraine has a total of approximately 1,600 artillery pieces, so a fraction of what Russia has fielded. While this may seem like a lot, it is inadequate considering the shortage of Soviet standard ammunition and now also NATO standard ammunition, the length of the front lines, and the size of the Ukrainian forces, and they left out the part where Russia outnumbers them by several times in both artillery pieces and ammunition. When you look at these numbers, and then you look at what is happening on the battlefield right now, we read articles from across the Western media about Ukrainian lines crumbling, Ukrainian forces retreating, the insufficient amount of arms and ammunition Ukraine has. This is the predictable result of a strategy of attrition that Russia has been using since this conflict began. This is the reason they chose attrition over, say, big arrow offensives. It was to preserve their manpower and equipment, and it was to grind down Ukrainian forces to the point where they are crumbling. And by the time Ukrainian forces are crumbling, not only has Russia preserved its manpower and equipment, it has much more of it than when it began the conflict. That is the whole point of all of this. That was what Russia set out to achieve, and that is what is now happening. The CSIS report moves on to drones. It says one of the biggest developments in this war, especially in 2023, was the rapid emergence and scaling up of the so-called Russian loitering munitions kill chain, a compilation of UAVs with the ability to find and track targets, convey targeting data, and then assign a firing mission to the selected strike asset. To complete the kill chain, Russia has relied on short-range tactical FPV drones and commercial quadcopters, mid-range Lancet and Kub drones, long-range Garand 2 drones, and then they talk about Elron, Orlan, and Supercam drones, to name a few. Then they talk about quantity, and they're talking about thousands and thousands of drones. They talk about companies manufacturing these larger, more capable drones, building entirely new facilities to produce them. It talks about Garand 2 drones and the Lancet kamikaze drone in particular, and this gives us a clue about how many artillery pieces Ukraine might still have left out of that 1,600 CSIS suggested in that other report. It says by the end of 2023, Russian forces have already fired an estimated 3,700 Garand 2 drones inside Ukraine, indicating a growing reliance on this weapon as a complement and surrogate to long-range missiles. Another Russian military go-to drone is the Lancet loitering munition lineup, with more than 1,000 recorded uses of this drone by February 2024 against Ukrainian high-value targets such as Western-provided long-range and precision artillery. So 1,000 Lancet drone strikes recorded, mainly targeting Ukrainian artillery. They have 1,600 artillery pieces. Not all 1,000 were on artillery pieces, but a large number of them were. And what it means is Ukraine most likely has less than 1,000 artillery pieces at this point. And Lancet drones are not the only way Russia can target Ukrainian artillery. Then it talks about missiles. We remember and have talked about often the Western media predicting Russia's missile supply running out any day now for the last 2 years. This is what they say now about Russian missile production. Despite the increasing significance of drones, the Russian military continued to rely on its tactical and long-range precision strike missiles to attack Ukrainian targets in 2023. By the end of last year, Russia had fired off an estimated 7,400 missiles into Ukraine since beginning its invasion. So when you hear Ukrainian officials begging for more Patriot air and missile defense systems, only around 500 to 600, maybe 650 interceptors are made every single year by the US. There was already a shortage, a global shortage of these missiles before the SMO began. You need about 2 missiles each for every incoming missile that you're trying to intercept. You can see how impossible it is for the US and Europe to provide Ukraine the means to defend themselves against this volume of Russian missiles. The pace of missile use ebbed and flowed, however, and the Russian military often fired its missiles together with Grad 2 drones to aid in penetrating Ukrainian air defense and increase their lethality. In one such attack in December 2023, Russia launched more than 100 missiles and dozens of drones against Ukrainian civilian targets. According to Western officials, Russia limited its cruise missile strikes in the second half of 2023 in an effort to build up stockpiles for attacks in 2024, I guess, except for the one in December where they fired over 100 missiles. The Russian Ministry of Defense's use of Iskander-M, Kinzhal, Kh-22, Kh-47, Kh-101, and other missiles is also expected to increase in 2024 as the domestic defense industry ramps up missile production. So they admit that Russia is firing thousands and thousands of missiles, and they are only increasing production, which means they will be firing even more. And as I pointed out, US, European air defense systems production and interceptor production is tiny by comparison. There's absolutely no way to defend against this quantity of missiles. And there's no way for the collective West to provide Ukraine with an equal or greater amount of missiles to fire back at Russian targets. Then it talks about electronic warfare systems. It doesn't give specific numbers of how many of these systems are being produced. But between this report and others from across the Western media that I've talked about recently, they admit that the Excalibur 155 millimeter GPS guided artillery shell has been rendered ineffective by Russian electronic warfare. GPS guided rockets fired by HIMARS, both the 70-kilometer range rocket, but also the ground-launched small-diameter bomb. That has also been rendered ineffective. And of course, HIMARS and the M270 fire the ATACMS missile, which has a range of up to 300 kilometers. It is also expected to suffer from Russian electronic warfare. And when you have all of these munitions being rendered ineffective, it means that Russia has saturated the line of contact with electronic warfare systems, which must mean production is as high and as high a priority for Russia as all of these other systems that they're mass producing and flooding onto the battlefield. Then there's an entire section in this paper about how Russia is circumventing sanctions. I'm not going to get into that. That is another conversation for another time. I will talk about the conclusions and recommendations of this 2024 paper. So it concludes by saying, the year 2024 may prove decisive for the Kremlin's war effort. The Russian Ministry of Defense, despite facing a number of weaknesses from labor shortages to entrenched corruption in the field of military procurement, will be able to sustain domestic arms production and import diversification efforts to continue its war effort. Western and especially US support for Ukraine, now expected to be resumed shortly, will be decisive in containing Russia, as well as curtailing the possibility of a direct future confrontation with Russia. But again, it's obvious for all to see that it is the exact opposite. The West cannot nearly produce as much as Russia, and because it cannot, Ukrainian lines are beginning to crumble, and the West will either have to cut its losses, admit that it failed in Ukraine, or it will have to intervene directly. And when NATO intervenes directly, they're still going to face the same critical shortages that Ukraine faces, because it is the West supplying Ukraine. If the West does not have enough ammunition, air defenses, other capabilities required by Ukraine on the battlefield, then where are they going to get these systems for their own troops when they go into Ukraine? What about recommendations? What does the paper say the US and its allies should do regarding vast and growing Russian military production? Continue supplying higher-end military equipment to Ukraine at a pace that exceeds Russia's production rate. That is impossible. Even the collective West has admitted they cannot match, let alone exceed, Russian production rates. And they are not making the systemic changes necessary in order to even begin the process of doing that, which, even if they decided to do that, would take years to do. This is what it says. This measure should be a top priority for the West, with Western countries focusing on the production of those weapon systems that are most likely to give Kiev a strategic advantage. According to CSIS's Mick Ryan, combat lessons from Ukraine must pass quickly from the battlefield to Western manufacturers, making it easier for soldiers to influence the production of equipment and munitions. But Western manufacturers prioritize profit. They don't care what lessons are being learned in Ukraine. They care about what makes them the most money quarter to quarter. That is the whole problem. These are the systemic changes the West needs to make, but will never make, so they will never solve this problem. The next recommendation is target Russia's oil revenues. Well, they've done that through sanctions and oil price caps. It hasn't worked. So what is their big idea here? This effort could focus on increasing oil production by countries like Saudi Arabia, who is now in BRICS and considers Russia an ally. So why would they comply with this US-European dictate? What's in it for Saudi Arabia? It also says decreasing purchases of Russian oil by countries like India and accelerating the clean energy transition. These are just things that are very easy to say, in reality, unrealistic. A transition to clean energy will take years, if not decades, before it starts affecting Russia's bottom line in terms of selling hydrocarbons to countries like China and India. What's in it for India to cut off cheap energy from Russia? I'm pretty sure that at least some politicians in India are well aware that the US and Europe will tolerate no competitor anywhere on earth. Once they're done with Russia and China, it'll be India who will be encircled, contained, divided, and destroyed. They do not want any country outside of the West competing against them, especially a former British colony like India. That is just a fact. Another recommendation: close sanctions loopholes and enforce existing export controls. Again, easier said than done. If it's something that they could do, they already would have been doing it. They don't offer any insight into how that could be done better than it already is, and it's not being done well at all. And then it says collaborate with the countries of the global south. What does that mean, the global south? It means every single country on earth outside of the collective West. That's what it means. And this is what it says. The Kremlin's ability to sustain this war is strongly conditioned by its cooperation with third countries. Cooperating with the countries of the global south that took neutral stances on Russia's invasion of Ukraine helped the Kremlin undermine Western attempts to isolate Russia on the international stage, reduce its military shortfalls on the battlefield, mitigate the impact of sanctions, and shape an anti-Western axis. The West should counter the Kremlin's efforts to build these alternative alliances by employing diplomatic tools to boost negotiations with U.S. allies and partners in the global south. Basically, coerce them, pressure them and coerce them into cutting off relations with Russia at odds with their own best interest. The authors of the CSIS report refuse to examine why the rest of the world is not going along with the U.S. and Europe in regards to Russia. And if they do not come to grips with the reality that the rest of the world can clearly see what is really going on in Ukraine. They understand that if the West is successful in undermining, dividing, and destroying Russia, they will be subordinated next. They can see that very clearly, and attempts to coerce them and compel them to isolate Russia is only going to actually further isolate the collective West. Finally, their final recommendation: begin planning for a strengthened and empowered European defense industry. And this is the details. Europe must urgently boost its defense production, potentially in cooperation with Ukraine. So this is the idea of building arms production facilities inside Ukraine, despite this report admitting a few paragraphs above that Ukraine is being buried in thousands of Russian missiles. While some important adjustments are already taking place, their speed remains too slow to deter Russia from such incursions in the future. That's just the nature of expanding military industrial output. It takes time. It takes months, a year, 2 years, several years, and that's only if you make a commitment to actually really expand it, which the West is not, because if they were determined to expand military industrial production, they would have to nationalize it, which they will never do. If you look at the end of the report, they have a section titled About the Authors and Contributors. These are people who have worked in the US government or have spent their life in academia. They have no real world experience in industry or in the military, which is why their analysis, conclusions, and recommendations are so absolutely, utterly unrealistic. And unfortunately, people like this have overrun Washington. And this is why Western foreign policy as a whole is so unrealistic. And ultimately, this proxy war against Russia and Ukraine is part of a much wider global policy of American hegemony, confronting and eliminating any peer or near peer competitor, global domination essentially, in a world where the balance of power economically, technologically, militarily is all starting to balance out. And so the West, which only makes up a small percentage of the global population, is finding itself in a world where other nations are able to compete on equal ground or greater ground economically and militarily, and yet they still insist on trying to impose themselves upon the rest of the world rather than work constructively together with the nations, alongside the nations of the world. And as long as they pursue unrealistic policies, they will always get disappointing outcomes, which is what is happening right now in Ukraine. And unfortunately, this is a process that is going to have to run its course. The rest of the world, Russia, China, their partners and allies, what they're trying to do to their best ability is mitigate the amount of death and destruction that takes place until a more rational circle of interests come into power in the West and finally do decide to work alongside the rest of the world constructively. I will continue keeping a close eye on the conflict in Ukraine, as well as the factors affecting it, including military industrial production, both in Russia and across the collective West. Until then, if you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. Check the video description below for all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel. I do not monetize any of my other social media platforms that I'm on. If ads pop up, feel free to skip past them. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or even if you have no extra resources and you're just helping share my work with others, getting the word out there, that is all greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.